In March of 2021, leading South African private healthcare provider Netcare, in partnership with Standard Bank, listed the continent's first sustainability-linked bond on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Netcare, together with Standard Bank, raised R1 billion, a 3-year unsecured note through the bond that will enable the healthcare group to fulfill its sustainability objectives of reducing its carbon footprint by procuring more renewable energy and further improving its water efficiency, amongst its other SDG-linked objectives. The Sustainable Development Goals Center for Africa and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network published the 2020 edition of the Africa SDG Index, and according to the analysis of the current status and trends towards achieving the SDGs, SDG 13, which looks at climate action, is the only goal for most African countries, which is on track. And SDG 12, looking at responsible consumption and production, is also an area of better performance for Africa overall. Now, decoupling economic growth from resource regeneration is a call to action and a strategic approach to a greener and more sustainable Africa economy. Proudly hosted by PPC, our discussion today will highlight the strategic and systematic changes that need to occur at a macro and a microeconomic level required in the advancement of decoupling resource consumption from economic growth. We also take a glance at the role of impact enveloped in SDGs, the UN Global Compact and ESG, and its imperative design in carrying out sustainable practices and innovation. And we critically engage the guarantee of the stabilization of resource and energy consumption and its imprint, as well as how economies across the continent are participating in this endeavor. But before we do that, here's a word from our sponsor, PPC, in this conversation.
Our heritage on the African continent has taught us one thing. If we want to build fast, we can build alone. If we want to build stronger buildings that stand the test of time, we must build with those who call Africa home. Building beyond the needs of our current environment to unlock the potential that gives PPC its unrelenting optimism. We remain an integral part of the growth ambition across Africa's construction and built environment, as well as fostering an innovative culture to strengthen the category into the future. PPC is invested in building a stronger Africa. We know what it means to empower a community to experience a better quality of life. We have seen the African sky shine brighter every time a new structure has touched the ground. We have witnessed the growth of families and communities through the development and empowerment of entrepreneurs. We are scientifically informed, 100% local production. We are unrelenting in the manufacturing of premium quality products. We embody the hopes and dreams of all who call Africa home. We understand what an Africa built by Africans means. It is a place where dreams to build a stronger continent can be realized without the threat of substandard workmanship and product in homes, schools, clinics, and the roads that connect us. This dream of building a stronger Africa is not only for the ones that answer the call to build, but for anyone who looks optimistically to the horizon and believes that we can create the future we desire. Join the journey today and realize what it means to build stronger with PPC. Building stronger communities, building stronger businesses, building stronger schools, building stronger roads. PPC, building a stronger Africa.
Now, this discussion is led by thought leaders across multiple sectors who will be engaging with us with a multitude of expansive expertise to answer and navigate this question at bay. In Zambia, we're joined by Snowden Madi, the infrastructure expert at the African Union Development Agency, or NEPAD. Snowden, welcome to the conversation. In South Africa, we are joined by radio Rachel Chikwamba, the Group Executive for Chemicals, Agriculture, Food and Health at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. Rachel, we very much look forward to your engagement. And rounding off our panel discussion is Professor Adrian Saval, the Director at the Center for African Management and Markets at the Gordon Institute of Business Science. Thank you all for joining us today, and we definitely look forward to a meaningful discussion. As we open up the floor and invite your reflections to open up this discussion, when we look at the task at hand of decoupling, it will take a couple of strategic approaches across policies, across capacities and our capabilities, across technologies as well. And I'm really interested in your reflections in the immediate response to this environment that we find ourselves in across the continent. And I suppose, Snowden, I'll start with you from an infrastructure lens in terms of how we are looking at the current moment.
Thank you very much, Vuyo, and greetings to the fellow colleagues on the panel. First of all, I think let me start to respond to your question by looking at why is it that we are talking about decoupling. I'll present, I think, just about 5 factors as to the reasons why I feel it is necessary to decouple. First, you may have come across, or maybe when you're undertaking some of the projects, either it be domestic projects or even projects at home, that the demand for raw materials is increasing. And that's a fact. The second item is that approximately 80% of the consumer goods and materials are thrown away. Thirdly, 30% of all processed foods goes into the West. Immediately, they hit the supply chain. And 10%, if I talk of 10%, let me just maybe put it a little bit higher. 20% of occupancy in cars in Africa. If you're going to work today, the question that I'll put across is to say, how many of you were in that car? It's a 5-seater car, most likely, but how many of you were there in the car? Most probably there was 1, if not 2. And finally, 10 to 15% of the materials in construction go to waste. This calls to this particular discussion, which is very pertinent, as to why do we need to decouple our economic growth by solely depending on the natural resources that we have. So the African Union Development Agency, as most of the stakeholders might have noted, or most of the stakeholders do complain, is that most of the regional economic communities, international bodies are always talking, developing policies which are never implemented. Out of this particular problem, then NEPAD was transformed to African Union Development Agency with the sole objective of implementing policies which have been developed at the continental level. And to this particular subject that we're discussing today, the African Union Development Agency, AUD and NEPAD, has developed its strategic plan for 2020 to 2023. And out of this strategic plan, there are 7 key priority areas. Suffice to say that out of these 7, 4 of these priority areas are looking at the environment. And that is, I will only mention about these 4 only. We're looking at the human and institutional development to catalyst. We are looking at sustainable energy. We are looking at climate resilience, environment and natural resources management. And we are looking at science, technology, and innovation as being some of the factors that will help us in decoupling from the use of natural resources as we try to grow our economies. So just to cover up on the infrastructure arena part of it, to implement these programs, the heads of states from the continent agreed to have a program which we call PIDA. PIDA stands for the Program of Infrastructure Development in Africa. This program looks at all the sectors of infrastructure. We are looking at how the ICTs can be developed. We are looking at the transport sector. In the transport sector, we are both looking at all kinds of transport, looking at rail, looking at roads, we are looking at maritime, and we are looking at air transport. And as we are looking at these modes of transport, the core theme behind it is making sure that we're having sustainable transport systems. We also are looking at the energy components. We're looking at getting energy from where energy is being produced efficiently. We are looking at promoting green energy. We are looking at promoting renewable energy. We're also looking at water utilization. So just to sum it up, the African continent is now on the move, making sure that we are using our resources optimally and making sure that we are saving for the generation to come. Thank you so much, Vuyo.
Absolutely. I love the point of Africa being on the move. And of course, later on, we will be unpacking the strategic plan as well as PIDA and how these initiatives and these strategies will be important in how we understand and we move to your point. Rachel, I'm going to bring you into this, and particularly in your opening remarks, I want you to speak to technology. And it being a regenerative resource and how we could actually move ahead to being a greener and a profitable continent. Rachel, you are on mute. I suppose it wouldn't be a virtual discussion if that wasn't the case.
So my apologies for making that very layman mistake, but it is an absolute pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists today, to be having this conversation with you. And my opening remarks build on something that Snowden has said, which speaks to how Africa, focusing on Africa as such, is a very resource-intensive, extractive-based set of economies. And in fact, the problem is most of the resources are extracted and exported with very little beneficiation and value add. And in fact, very little of those resources remain on the continent as local stock for us to use to build our own economies. And even when we do build our own economies, the resource consumption patterns are very linear. And we would want, in the conversation of decoupling, to be able to say, how do we make these linear extractive value chains and resource flows a little bit greener and a little bit more secular? But in order for us to have that particular conversation, I think that we need to address the issue of maximum local beneficial use of resources in support of the continent's own socio-economic development. So the whole idea of how we can use tech to add value to our natural resources to build our own local economies, and doing it in such a manner that we enable ourselves to cycle a lot of the resources and they don't go to waste. I think Snowden mentioned something that's really very important when he then says, you know, once these things are extracted, about 80% of it goes back to waste. It goes back to the landfill. It goes back to emissions. It goes back to really then making us not exactly as climate smart as we ought to be. So I want to tackle that. And in conversation, I want to also talk about how we can speak a lot more to reinventing our relationship with resources, where we need to start thinking about creating a sharing economy. Snowden spoke about the whole idea that think about transportation. We think of it as each must have their own car. Could we change that mindset and say we could have a ride-share type of thing using business models that are enabled by ICT and digitalization to start to do and think about things differently within the context of our own developing countries, then looking at, and which is a perspective that I will look through this conversation from, and the lens through which I will look this conversation from, which is that at the CSIR, we are about developing technologies right now to drive industrial development, but also a capable state. So I would like to talk about how we have used some of those technologies to drive industrial development as we see it, and to bring competitiveness into our sectors through a lens that then says, how do we think about sustainability and being green and so on? And so for us, we do take a very systematic approach to say, when we look at our economies, how do we look at the ones that are most likely to make an impact on economic growth and competitiveness from a lens of impact and attractiveness, and how we then bring technology, the ease of influence to bring competitiveness to that sector through tech. We then go through a process where we then say, if we look at those sectors that we prioritize, how then do we analyze what technologies are out there? And we've been having a buzz lately, since this is Tech Week, I think it is appropriate, on the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. So we talk about 4IR, from biotech to human language technologies, to ICT, to 3D printing, to all sorts of precision lasers and other technologies that we can bring into our basket of innovation to say, how do we, in a green manner, bring competitiveness to these sectors? Benchmarking, of course, with how the leaders in tech have used technologies to decouple the manner in which we perform our industrial development, extract resources, use them, convert them to product, to make sure that then we do it in such a manner that we can regenerate the resource and we can minimize our global footprint. And in that regard, we systematically come to strategies of how we then use tech to drive a greener economy. So I do have quite a few case studies, but I'll be unpacking those in the next part of our conversation. Thank you, Vuyo.
Absolutely, and I think we cannot wait to hear about, to your point, the impact attractiveness of technology and how we engage with that through the transition of decoupling. Adrian, I am going to you, Professor, and looking at in your engagement with the various African economies and multiple stakeholders that you do engage in and engage with at GIBS. What is your response and I suppose your reflections on the current immediate environment, which would henceforth enable us to decouple for the future and the present?
Thanks, Vuyo. It's great to be with you. And I think that there's a couple of aspects to highlight just as jump-off points. The first is referencing a recent panel discussion that I was part of, talking about the Build Back Better movement or proposal that, post-COVID, we've got a chance to build back better, and references there are to sustainability, efficiency, economies and resource use, and so on. My complaint or my objection to that is that if this is a reference to Pan-African economies, we're not building back better. These haven't been built in the first instance. And so there is an extraordinary opportunity to build here brand new and to build, if we're going to stay with the alliteration, to build brilliantly. And that's about bringing in efficiencies, economies, innovations that ensure that we design systems and solutions that are decoupled. And why would this be important? Well, the African population is a little over 1 billion people. Which makes us equivalent in size to perhaps India or China, with a little over 1 billion population each. But the African economy is, from a per person perspective, is substantial. It is an economic giant of the future. If we follow the resource intensity path that has been followed by Asian economies from the 1990s in particular, you've seen Asian economies enjoy substantial gains in per person income, improvements in human development indices, and all of these belong to the collective ambition of Africa's 55 countries. However, over the past 30 years, resource consumption in Asian economies has increased by a factor of three times. So there is this massive step up in the use of resources, resource intensity. You've got some particularly sort of standout examples. Mongolia is a case in point, which has a very, very inefficient use of resources. And if we were to take this as evidence of how we might develop over the next 20 or 30 years, and then I would bring us back to progress that is happening in the African context with the likes of Rwanda, Ethiopia, running along with 7, 8, 9% economic growth. Not as impressive, but still very robust. You've got Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, putting down 4 and 5% economic growth. Aggregate this, and we're talking about populations of hundreds of millions of people who will build higher consumption patterns with urbanization, Snowden's world, infrastructure development that parallels this urbanization. And then as the middle class bulges, you get consumption patterns that are energy and resource intensive. So part of this build back or build for the first time, here is a chance for us to do things very, very differently. I think the positive in this, Rachel spoke about innovations, and I imagine that she will speak about microeconomic innovations. There are also macroeconomic innovations. And perhaps when we come back to talk about the potential paths, I think both of these can be pursued. That from a microeconomic perspective, it's about innovation at the level of the company, at the level of communities, and at macroeconomic, it's we can learn from other countries. And as much as I'm complaining about Asian economies that have built these very resource inefficient pathways, there are examples that we can learn from in the same cluster, country cluster or regional cluster. Japan, New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea, and more recently Thailand have all shown ways in which you can build substantial gains in per capita income and do it decoupling from resource use to build on the theme of this conversation. So we don't have to invent this. We can borrow and learn and build from the platform that has been established by others.
Absolutely. Well, a stellar statement, Prof. And I think to Rachel's sentiment around building better relationships that we have with resources to the sharing economy. And we certainly will be coming back to the point around the list of these innovations, right? And I think what's going on across the continent. And to Prof's point around going back to Snowden's world, Snowden, I'm going to come back to you, particularly from the macroeconomics of it. And earlier on, you pointed to the 7 points of the strategic plan, but I really want you to speak to the 4 and the intensity of those, especially when the development agency is advising on really key strategic decisions and decision makers who are part of that conversation.
Thank you very much, Vuyo, for bringing me back to the initial conversation, specifically on the policy arena. You know, one of the challenges that we have in the continent is the abject poverty that the continent faces. And combined with the abject poverty and also the political will, they sometimes seem to be a mismatch on what the political arena would be looking for in terms of convincing its own electorate and then putting across what I would call painful policies. Still, as AUD NEPAD, our role is to advise and make sure that we're doing good for the continent. I'm putting across this particular point because for us to remain a continent that is sustainable and we are not depleting our resources for the generation to come, we need to put in place some policies which are going to be a little bit painful. I'm looking at part of let's just look at an example of the road transport that we've talked about. If you look at the cars that are plying trade on the roads of the continent, most of these cars, one, they're either not built in Africa. Two, most of these cars are brought in as second-hand cars, and that is coming out from the unaffordability of brand new cars and the abject poverty that the continent has. It doesn't mean that the continent is poor. The continent is very rich, and it's one of the richest continents in the world, but we just need to use our resources properly and effectively. So as a policy making mechanism, and what AUD and NEPAD is also advocating, is to make sure that policies are put in place that will address this particular challenge of the environment. The unfortunate part in a globalized, in a global economy, on a globalized world, the challenge is that the Western world is talking of something else. Africa is also talking of something else. There's so many agreements which have been put in place, but when you look at addressing the challenge of pollution and making our environments clean, you find out all these second-hand cars are coming out from Europe. And where they're coming from, it's very expensive for them to be driven. However, they come to Africa and we're using them. So we need to put in place these particular policies, which are very difficult, they're very painful, but they were good for the generation to come. So as a policy making part of it, AUD and NEPAD is involved in conducting research and development. And in the research and development, it is now research-based evidence that is helping us in terms of crafting the policies that are advanced at the EU level. So I'm just going to speak on that one, just to highlight that particular point, that one particular painful item that we need to put on the fore is that of making painful policies that will address some of the challenges that we're having to decouple the use of reliance of the natural resources in advancing our economic growth. So let me just pause in there. I think you allowed me to be coming in and off as my colleagues are also be contributing on the same subject, so that I critically highlight some of the issues on the infrastructure part of it. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think a critical point to what you brought was definitely the political will that should match the abject poverty that Africa really lives on, and the mandate of the agency being quite clear in not only providing the knowledge-based advisory services, but also acting as the continent's technical interface on policy development, recommendation, as well as the implementation. Dr. Rachel, I'm going to come to you and mention something that Snowden slightly touched on, but that is the R&D lens of it, right? The research and development that has been taking place, and perhaps if you could speak to the CSIR's initiative on how driving profitability through tech is definitely greener and profitable as well.
Thank you very much. And I want to build also on something that Adrian says to begin this part of the conversation, where we say that we need interventions and innovation at the macro level and also at the micro level. And so I hope that I can connect the things that we do when we think about the role of innovation at the macro level through obviously this systematic analysis of the sectors that will bring economic growth to the country, the ones where we have a lot of employment multipliers, all those job creation I've spoken to, backward and forward linkages in order to enhance growth, and. We go through this very systematically and we say, these are in fact the priority sectors as we see them, to include, of course, health and education. And then we go in there and then we say, what is the role of tech in addressing the pain points in each of these particular sectors? And then we then say, how do we start to apply with our industrial partners some of these technological applications and innovations to try and improve performance? So if I could give an example, I want to talk about an example that starts from the raw material all the way to a highly competitive industry where we want to build a larger share of these high value industries for South African economies, for the South African and African economies, if you think about it, in a manner that is sustainable. So I want to talk about the work that we do to support advanced manufacturing industries, and these will include things such as automotive, aerospace, and defense. And these industries rely a lot on very specialized parts. And so we've done work to try and bring value addition to raw materials that Africa is endowed on, is really very richly endowed with. The example that I will cite is the one of titanium, where we have the bulk, over 80% of the natural resource material of titanium raw sands. And what we're trying to do here is we have developed some very original technologies to allow us to convert that raw sands into titanium metal. The challenge that we're facing right now is one that I spoke about, the very extractive effort of taking out the raw sands, exporting them without beneficiation, and then importing the metal parts, the metal when processed, so that we can build parts for aircraft, for automotive, for health applications, among others. So what we've done is to develop such technologies and such proprietary technology to locally convert those raw materials into metal so that we achieve that maximum beneficiation that I was talking about. As a step further to that, we're trying to really build these particular industries, and we're saying, can we do it in such a manner that we minimize waste? So we've developed technologies around taking that metal powder, using 3D printing aerospace parts. And in fact, we can very proudly say that at the CSIR here in South Africa, we have one of the largest original printers, that 3D printers that can build whole parts for aircraft, supporting the likes of Aeroseed and Denelo and others that are in the aerospace sector. We use this technology as well to then, and let me perhaps speak to the regenerative and perhaps greener part dimension to this conversation, which is that instead of creating metal, create a metal billet, and then you chisel away and waste to create a part, we print the parts with such precision that there is no waste. And we feel that this is beginning to become the basis of a highly competitive industry that is of high value to the South African economy. And we can grab a little more of those high value global chains when we do that. So we start from beneficiation. We use with original patented technology. We go into the whole idea of process innovation, where we say, can we do this in such a build parts in such a manner that we don't waste any resource or any of these materials, all the way to saying, can we start through this process to build highly competitive industries that compete on a global scale. So this is one basket of technologies that we can talk about with 3D printing and so on in dealing with the issue of beneficiation. I can cite some other technologies that are different. I want to shift away from those advanced industries to something that we do in agriculture, focusing on precision agriculture, where we use our earth observation capabilities all the way to drones to develop really earth observation tools that allow us to drill down into the manner in which we farm, where we look at the different crop types, and then we can then say, as we assess that crop type, we start to see issues of water and hydration, issues of soil and soil facility, and to provide on a weekly basis and making it even closer to a daily basis, actionable decision-making information to the farmers and farmer associations to then say, how do they respond by precisely bringing water to the plants without wasting the water? How do they precisely fertilize the soil without over-fertilizing the soil and
draining fertilizers into the waterways and, leading to eutrophication of our waterways. And. So those are the types of technologies that we deal with. And we believe that it is through many of these innovations that we can actually bring green approaches to economic development. We have a lot of things that we do in the energy space, and I have a whole set of ideas to expand there is a later part of the conversation. But for me, the way that we're looking at this is to say, how do we use technology to maximally beneficiate resources, number one, to use them efficiently so that we minimize the things that we send to the Western landfills and so on. One of our key technologies that we're also very proud of is the work that we do in biopolymers, where we're looking to say, can we start to develop polymers that are recyclable for the plastics industry so that we don't send everything to the landfill again and it doesn't degrade very, very readily. So I could cite many examples where we begin to say, how do we look at our industries and start to say, how do we use technology to bring that green dimension to the manner in which we make our economies competitive. Adrian said that our economies are yet to be built. I'd like to believe that we have the building blocks that we need to build these economies. Innovation is a great part, and tech is a great part of how we do that building. And these specific examples that we're citing, we are taking to the sectors where we work with the likes of the DTIC, which is our Department of Technology and Industry, to say, how do we bring sector level transformation by bringing these technologies on board? Where we have conversations with the like of our departments of science and innovation to say, in our white paper on innovation, how do we build into the innovation discourse the idea that technology can allow us to become greener even as we strive to build our economies. Yeah. So we don't follow the paths that the likes of other countries that use the resource path to development. We can chart our own course. Absolutely. Building on technologies, learning from them, but of course, avoiding the pitfalls that they had when they did their own thing. So I'll pause here because I'm sure I'm not the only panelist to talk about this, but I do have more examples that we can speak to.
Absolutely, and I think such concrete and excellent examples from advanced tech to the circular economy, of course, looking at good agricultural practices, and biotech to the work that CSIR is doing. And Adrian, I'm going to invite you into this conversation as well, and expanding to your earlier point around the touch points of African economies, and really looking at minimizing the waste, creating not only high value, but shared value. And perhaps if you could look at the undertakings that have been happening and some findings to support this conversation, and perhaps to put you on the spot here as well on how an agreement like the Africa Trade Agreement could definitely tighten this argument and the trade from a beneficial perspective to Rachel's point, and how it can benefit the Africa economy.
You know, Vuyo, I think that last point that you raise is particularly interesting because there is a global policy thrust drive to evidence initiatives that are that show improvements in resource intensity, material use, and so on. And one way of achieving really good domestic consumption footprints is by importing resource-intensive goods, and that shows then that your domestic economy has been able to achieve high levels of consumption without drawing on high levels of domestic resources. So there's ways that you can play a policy game here, and so I think the jump-off point for me in responding is that any approach that we adopt here has to be holistic. It has to recognize that solutions cannot be assessed on a country-by-country or case-by-case basis. And if there are people who are gaming the agenda or who know how to shift the rules to present a better face, then it's exactly that. They've gamified policy. So my urging would be about an holistic approach. A second thing that you make me think of is that when we look at the progression of countries, it is the case that as countries push higher in human development indices, that tends to correspond with urbanization, with infrastructure, and with higher levels of consumption. However, and I've made the point, but I think it really needs to be emphasized, is that we have many country cases, examples where countries, entire populations have generated substantial gains in human development indices without equivalent gains in material consumption. Singapore is arguably the standout example. South Korea is another good example. China, having put down decades of extraordinary growth, has actually become particularly attuned to the importance of this decoupling and their obligation to ensure that growth does not come at the expense of inefficiencies and waste, and at the expense of unsustainable or at the price of unsustainable growth. That isn't the case for everyone. Vietnam, for instance, has gone in the wrong direction. So Laos is another example. So what can we learn from those that have put down very functional and effective pathways, and what can we also learn from those that have misstepped? And in an ideal world, we will be able to import those functional, sort of linear, smooth transitions that mean that we couple gains in economic performance with human development indices, whilst decoupling that with energy, resource use, the environment, and so on. If we take lessons from some of these countries that I've referenced, and I realize that I'm sort of talking around your point, but hopefully this contributes to the conversation. There's a number of sort of real standout principles that we can learn from these other countries. And the first is that this has to be a national agenda, that this can't be piecemeal or fragmented, adopted by one but not adopted by the other. It's got to be a national initiative. The second is there needs to be means and mechanisms to monitor and to evaluate and to manage compliance with those national agendas. And so that talks then about the 30,000 feet, the overarching sort of macroeconomic policy framework, creating the imperative and the initiative, and then having the capacity to monitor and manage. In good economic fashion, I'm going to bring in my howevers, though, and say the however. And if we're talking about the Pan-African context, we know that one of the big challenges in measuring and monitoring is the absence of information. And so, Rachel, here's a great place where we can innovate, right? Where we can build systems for measuring, which then allows for the management and monitoring. And that's about information and data. And through that, we can then achieve the outcomes of resource efficiency, improvements in utilization, improvements in footprints, in material footprints, and so on. And then into that, adapt and adopt, which would include things such as effective waste management, recycling, reuse, and so on. And this really goes back to the points that Snowden was making about, in the food channel, for instance, from factory to mouth, 50% of food is lost. I mean, that's just a spectacularly inefficient use of resources. What can we do that ensures that we don't follow that same path? He also made reference to the wastage of materials in construction. He spoke about 15 and 20% materials, loss of materials in construction. What can we do that is different? And I think the elegance of learning from these other countries is that those are adoptable. And then at the microeconomic level, I'll make this my last point, we've got fantastic stuff like Jugaad Innovation, which is street level innovation, or Xiaolan Fu, the Oxford academic. She's done some fantastic work on African innovation under the radar. And these are real sort of on the ground examples of innovations that are grown to solve to borrow from the throwaway, to solve, African problems with African solutions.
Solving African problems with African solutions. I think what we've done is really created this foundation and laying this foundation of understanding what decoupling is, and of course through a showcase of some regenerative resources that can be implemented to ensure that economic growth is the output and the outcome of such endeavors. Rachel, I'm going to come back to you on long-term recovery, right? And I think as we talk to impact, as we talk to monitoring, evaluating, accountability, and the learning and development of it, there's an interesting concept of the energy mix that plays into this conversation. Briefly unpack this to us and how CSIR is engaging.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And in fact, I think that Adrian gave me a very nice segue to go into this topic, where he was looking for evidence and data. And I want to say very quickly, at a very high level, institutions in South Africa are really, really modeling resource flows very accurately, I would like to believe, in our country. And we are part of that particular effort. And I'm looking forward to a time when we will release our publications on the circular economy for business and the circular economy for a capable state, which will inform policy. But moving on to the particular subject that we're speaking about now, the CSIR is also involved quite deeply in making contributions because of our energy modeling capabilities, our abilities to look at the different components of the energy mix and then say what could be the ideal mix for South Africa. So we do contribute to the integrated resource plan, which is driven by the Ministry of Minerals and Energy. But moving quickly to the topic that you have asked me to speak to specifically, Vuyo. Speaking about industrial development and energy and economic development and uncoupling speaks to we need energy that is priced and that has a stable and predictable price trajectory, supporting long-term investments in decision-making where energy input costs have significant impact on investment decisions. We need that stable supply that matches the demand. But most importantly, we need to increase sustainability using sustainable-based renewable energy with low and or declining carbon intensity so that the carbon border taxes and carbon taxes do not erode the competitiveness of our industries. I was talking to a colleague who was speaking to actually how now internationally where we export, you would go into a supermarket and find they do put energy footprints of the various products and consumers are voting with their feet. And to address this challenge, I think that there are so many things that we could potentially do to maximize the incorporation of these particular renewable energies into our mix. For example, we need access to climate finances to accelerate the implementation of renewable energy and that just transition from fossil fuels. We need to be levering the rapidly decreasing costs of renewable energy and energy storage to electrify Africa through a combination of grid, mini-grid, and off-grid solutions. We need to be really leveraging Africa's diversity in renewable energy resources, including solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal, and this can be done while responsibly utilizing fossil fuel resources, and in particular transitional fuels like natural gas to complement the renewable energy deployment. We've got considerable mineral assets, and the value chain for the manufacturing of the emerging new technologies includes things like advanced batteries and fuel cell technologies and so on. So not only to extract these things unsustainably, but say, how do we extract them with a view to drive renewable energy sources? We all know about the heartbreaking stories around the mining of cobalt across the continent, and there is issues of child labor, there is issues of many unsustainable practices to drive the development of chips or something like this in industries that are outside of our own continent. We really need to address this. We need to look at the deployment of advanced demand-side management and energy efficiency in industrial processes to reduce end-use demand. And in fact, one of the initiatives that we have at the CSIR with UNIDO is one in which we go into industries sector by sector, look at their operations and their factory layout and how they run their plants, to say, how do we maximize energy and water use efficiency therein. We look at the deployment of embedded energy supply and storage solutions within the industrial plants and the industrial parks with a view to reduce costs, to reduce emissions, and to increase supply availability. And we need to start talking about the development and implementation of new business models of shared ownership and operation of power generation, and the wheeling of power to multiple off-takers in a manner that drives investment in the new energy infrastructure to support industrial development. And then lastly, perhaps I want to highlight the export of green hydrogen and green hydrogen products to the region to support the work that we do in the renewable energy space and leveraging industrial development that would support such large-scale production and will stimulate the inclusion in local manufacturing of such energy sources and really change and transform the value chains to build and maintain the associated plans. So those are some things that I tried to say in a little bit of a rush, but I hope they bring to the fore the issues that we have to deal with when we look at a just energy transition from one that is really intensive and fossil-based and potentially finite and not as clean as we would like it to be, to something that is cleaner and greener, but looking beyond energy generation itself, to saying when we look at metals extraction, how do we also then put on the lens of sustainability and uncoupling as we do that?
Absolutely, and I think those points have been very clear in how we could definitely engage through the energy mix. Snowden, I'm going to come back to you on your theme in the concept of leaving no one behind. And what I want you to really engage on is the strategy that and the approach that we had mentioned earlier on PIDA, and how that plays a role in essentially not leaving any African behind.
Thank you very much, Vuyo. Africa is diverse, and with the PIDA program, the objective is to make sure that all members are moving at the same pace. And what happened in the development of the PIDA program was that the program was driven from the grassroots itself. We have 8 economic blocks in the continent. And these 8 economic blocks have got their members. For example, let me use the case of SADC. SADC has got about 15, if not 16 member states, which belong to them. And in developing the PIDA program, SADC had to convene its members to make sure that they submit programs which will drive their economic development. And these programs had to be filtered at the SADC level to make sure that these programs are not resource intensive, i.e. we are decoupling the use of resources and making sure that these programs are not resource intensive, but we're growing the economies of the continent by making sure that we are using sustainable means. So that's how the development of the PIDA program came. And with these all RECs coming together, then their programs were amalgamated at the continental level, and that's what constituted the PIDA program. In that way, the process has been that no member state is left behind. However, there are challenges in implementing the PIDA program in that as the continental program, we've tried as much as we can to make sure that there are those countries that are lagging behind. But when it comes up to infrastructure programs that have been developed, programmed, financing becomes a little bit of a challenge, because there are certain environmental factors, there are also certain conducive political challenges that some countries may be facing that may not attract financing to these particular programs, which are aimed at driving economic growth. So one thing that the continent must be looking at is also to look at how does the continent itself generate resources that should be in a position to finance its own programs. And that's one particular issue that I think we must look at it critically, because over-dependence on financing from external partners has made some other countries to lag behind in terms of development if they're not able to raise resources that can finance those particular programs. So I think as a continent, it's time now that we must be looking at generating our own internal resources to make sure that those countries that are lagging behind should be also assisted in terms of generating that particular growth that we're looking at. And just to conclude, I think allow me to contribute to what Dr. Chikwamba has just also alluded to when it comes up to the issue of energy. I was listening attentively, and I think I had picked up one or two issues that I wanted to contribute. And as a matter of fact, when you look at the continent as a whole, without looking at the PIDA program itself, we've got a mammoth task to make sure that there is equitable access to electricity. There's about 600 million inhabitants of the continent, and we're roughly about 1.2 or so billion inhabitants of the continent. And out of that, 600 million people do not have access to electricity. And out of that as well, we've got about 890 million of people who are still to date, as we're talking now, 2021, they are using fossil fuels for their cooking. And that's how challenging it is when we're talking about energy. And then look at the resources that the continent has. When we talk of sunlight, the solar energy that the continent can generate from the solar that we do have in the continent, it's quite enormous. But why is it that we're not able to provide for these particular individuals that cannot afford electricity? The issue is about how expensive the solar components are. Expensive that the initial investment cost on its own deters citizens or individuals from going the solar route.
Absolutely.
In the long term, they are using now the fossil fuels to cover for the energy deficit that is currently prevailing. So I think one thing that we must be looking at to say, how can we industrialize ourselves? How can we use technology? How can we innovate to make sure that these particular components are manufactured and made in Africa and provided at a cost that is affordable and that can be utilized to close up this particular gap? And that will be one of the ways also of decoupling the usage of these natural resources which are going extinct, because people don't have an option. If they don't have the option, then we need to have that technology to put in place. We need to innovate, we need to industrialize and make sure that we are providing for some of these things that can be done locally instead of importing them. Thank you so much for you.
Thank you, Snowden. And Prof, as we wrap up the conversation, I think we've engaged from a high level, we've engaged the multiple stakeholders who are involved in this process. But my question to you as we close is, what do you say to ordinary South Africans, to ordinary Africans, to the innovators, the aspiring entrepreneurs who want to be active participants in the call to decoupling the economy and the growth that they can contribute to that?
For you, I would almost imagine that question was scripted, because you couldn't have asked a better question. And to everyone listening to this panel, I promise you that is not a scripted question. As Rachel was speaking, what I'm reminded of some recent research which has shown consumer preferences in emerging markets. And the consumer preferences in these emerging markets show an overwhelming preference for sustainable, renewable. And Rachel spoke about labeling and packaging as just two very obvious and immediate ways in which we as ordinary citizens can make immediate impact and contribution. Inside of this forum, alongside consumers, there will be producers, and those producers have the prospect to build brand new innovations and technologies. Snowden was speaking about these. Rachel was also, and we've got example after example of ways in which these efficiencies and innovations can be brought into the production side of the economy, alongside our more sensible, more sustainable decisions as consumers. And I think that the really powerful point is that very often the assumption is made that, oh well, if you're coming from an emerging market, you're going to put price ahead of everything else, and that you'll be blinded by price in your decision. And that is not what the evidence says. The evidence points to very conscious decisions amongst many consumers in new and emerging markets. And my closing observation would be to remind us of the Mountain Kingdom of Bhutan, who has put the measurement of gross national happiness as their primary barometer ahead of achieving growth in gross domestic product. It's growth in gross national happiness.
Absolutely. Well, I think a beautiful way to close off this discussion on how we could build better brilliantly. And to my panelists, thank you so much for this critical engagement. We definitely are looking forward to further engaging on how economic growth can be achieved through decoupling.
Thank you very much, Vuyolwethu.
Thank you.